My grandfather's house smelled like dust and dried ink. It was a scent that held 200 years of family history hostage, a heavy, suffocating perfume that made my throat ache with nostalgia every time I stepped across the threshold. But that day, the smell was sharper, laced with the metallic tang of legal obligation and the acrid, sterile air of inevitable change. We were clearing out the estate, a grim procession dictated by attorneys and probate, turning a lifetime of memories into items on a spreadsheet. And in the center of the vast, faded drawing room, dominating the space like a forgotten god, was the piano. It wasn't just a piano. It was the piano. A hulking, black ebony beast of a Steinway Model D concert grand. It looked like it had swallowed the light in the room, its polished surface dimmed by decades of neglect. This instrument was the crucible of my grandfather's genius, the massive sounding board that vibrated with every complex, soaring, and utterly heartbreaking melody Elias Thorne had ever written. He was a composer of legendary, almost reclusive stature, a man who preferred the company of 88 ivory keys to the clamor of the world. And yet, there it sat, silent. My sister, Sarah, walked past it without a pause, her sensible heels clicking impatiently on the parquet floor. Sarah had always treated the piano as an obstacle, a giant, non-yielding anchor weighing down her plans for a quick sale and a clean break. "It's ridiculous, Alex," she said, not even turning around, her voice crisp and efficient. "It's taking up a third of the room. It hasn't been played in 5 years." And the professional appraisal came back abysmal. It needs thousands in restoration work just to be playable. It's a useless piece of furniture now. An expensive, oversized paperweight. I flinched, physically, at the casual brutality of the phrase. "It's Elias Thorne's piano, Sarah. It belongs in a museum, or at least a professional musician's care, not sold for scrap value to some liquidator." I walked toward it, running my hand along the cool, smooth wood, a gesture of reverence. He wrote the Requiem for the Lost Stars on this instrument. The history alone makes it priceless. Sarah finally stopped, turning to face me with that look she reserved for my romantic excesses, a mixture of weary exasperation and sharp financial sense. "Priceless doesn't pay the taxes, Alex." The appraiser said it. "The veneer is chipped, the hammers are shot, and one of the pedals squeaks like a trapped mouse. It's an antique that's too big to move and too expensive to fix. We need the space cleared by Friday for the showing. I'm listing it for auction alongside the rest of the junk." She used the word junk with venom, driving a wedge between her pragmatic reality and my emotional attachment. That's when I played my card, the one thread of hope I'd clung to since the will was read. "What about the song?" The question hung in the dusty air. Even Sarah paused before sighing. "Oh, honestly, you and that ridiculous myth. It was probably just something he told his students to motivate them." The myth, of course, was the final, unreleased composition. Grandfather had been notoriously secretive about his last works. He had passed away suddenly, peacefully, at this very piano, just as a powerful storm broke outside. When the family came, the sheet music on the stand was blank, save for the opening bar of a simple, haunting C major chord, a signature he always used to begin new material. But he'd told me only weeks before, leaning in conspiratorially over a chessboard, that his swan song was finished. "It's ready, my boy," he'd whispered, his eyes twinkling. "A masterpiece, hidden away, protected from the world until the right moment." I, of course, assumed he meant hidden in his fireproof safe, or maybe digitized on a protected server. We found nothing, not a single note of the finished piece. "He told me it was protected," I insisted, my voice tight. "Not that it was burned. This piano was his sanctuary. He worked on it every single day for 50 years. If that song exists, Sarah, it's not in the safe, and it's not on the cloud. It's here." She threw her hands up in defeat, knowing arguing with my sentimentality was a waste of her valuable time. "Fine. You have until tomorrow morning. If you can find any evidence, any sheet music, a recording, anything that proves it's not just a useless hunk of wood, I'll hold the sale. But otherwise, it goes. I can't afford to lose this buyer, Alex." Her ultimatum was clear. 24 hours to prove a lifetime of musical genius was more valuable than a down payment on a house. I watched her leave, the click of her heels fading, replaced only by the profound silence of the room. I was alone with the behemoth. I knew the conventional hiding places, the bench storage, the inside of the lid, the small drawers in his desk. All had been searched by professionals. This had to be different, hidden away, protected from the world. I pulled up the bench and sat down. The keys were dusty but responsive. I played that single C major chord he'd left behind. The sound was rich but slightly muffled, definitely needing a tuning. But as my fingers lifted, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. On the cheek block, the wooden surface right next to the keys, there was a minute, almost invisible seam. It wasn't natural to the wood grain or the construction. It was faint, barely visible in the dim light. I ran my fingernail across it and felt the slightest resistance, a hair-thin break in the otherwise smooth finish. It was too small to be a drawer, too low to be a conventional compartment. It looked like a deliberate alteration, a cunning little secret carved into the body of the instrument. My heart started to hammer against my ribs, suddenly realizing this wasn't just sentimentality anymore. This was a mystery, and my grandfather, the great Elias Thorne, had always loved a grand, theatrical secret. I leaned in closer, tracing the line, and knew with sudden, chilling certainty. The old grand piano wasn't just furniture. It was a vault, and I only had 24 hours to break into it. The unreleased song wasn't on the piano. It was most definitely in it. I stared at the hair-thin seam until my eyes swam. It was a secret hidden in plain sight, a microscopic challenge left by a man who understood music and structure better than anyone I knew. Grandfather Elias Thorne hadn't just put the song in the piano. He had turned the piano itself into a puzzle box. My initial rush of excitement was quickly tempered by the realization that this was a delicate piece of history. One wrong move, one splintered piece of priceless ebony, and I'd not only ruin a beautiful antique, but also hand Sarah the perfect excuse to scrap the whole endeavor. I rushed to the tool shed in the garage, a disorganized mausoleum of rusty implements. I didn't need a crowbar, I needed surgical precision. I returned with a jeweler's loupe, a set of fine dental picks, borrowed indefinitely from my long-suffering dentist friend, and a bottle of furniture polish, mostly for show, in case Sarah decided to stage a midnight raid. The clock on the mantelpiece ticked with the brutal efficiency of a financial auditor, mocking my dwindling 24 hours. Back at the piano, I put the loupe to my eye. The seam was incredibly precise, a testament to my grandfather's obsessive attention to detail. But I noticed two minuscule indentations, barely large enough for the tip of a sewing needle, on either side of the hairline crack. They were almost invisible against the black lacquer, but under the magnification, they suggested a release mechanism. I carefully, agonizingly slowly, tried to insert the finest dental pick into one of the tiny holes. The metal scraped against wood, but found no purchase. I tried the other side. Nothing. The entire thing felt static, solid. Frustration clawed at me. This wasn't some cheap mystery novel. This was reality, where locks jam and secrets stay stubbornly locked. I leaned back, rubbing the bridge of my nose, forcing myself to think like Elias. He was an artist, not an engineer. His mechanism wouldn't be complex. It would be musical. I looked down at the keys, then back at the seam near the high A note. What if the keys themselves were the combination? I began to experiment, pressing 3 keys at once, then 2, then a random sequence. The seam remained closed. I tried the opening C major chord he'd left on the music stand. Click. Nothing. The silence was deafening. I felt the familiar weight of self-doubt settle in my stomach. Maybe Sarah was right. Maybe I was just wasting time, chasing a phantom composition, driven by sentimentality while the real world waited with its foreclosure notices. But then I remembered his eccentricity. Grandfather never did anything simply. He detested convention. I looked at the seam again, focusing on its location right by the keys. It was perfectly placed to be pressed by the fleshy part of a thumb while playing. What if it wasn't about playing a sequence, but about applying pressure while simultaneously engaging a different mechanism? I used one hand to apply firm, steady pressure directly onto the seam. With the other hand, I pressed the piano's pedals. First the una corda, soft pedal, then the sostenuto. Nothing. Finally, I pressed the damper pedal, the sustain pedal that lifts the felt dampers off the strings, letting all the notes ring out. As the pedal hit the floor with a slight thud, I heard a faint, almost imperceptible snick near my thumb. I released the pressure and the pedal, hardly daring to breathe. The tiny section of the cheek block, no bigger than a matchbox, had popped open a fraction of an inch, revealing a velvet-lined niche. My hands were shaking as I gently pulled the small door open. It wasn't full of rolled sheet music or a flash drive, which would have been too simple. Instead, it held a single item, an antique, tarnished brass tuning fork, perfectly nestled in the velvet. But it wasn't a standard A440 tuning fork. Engraved deeply into the metal handle were three symbols: a small treble clef, followed by the number 5, and then a single, distinct star. A tuning fork, a musical tool, but cryptic. Treble clef, 5, star. I lifted it out. The brass was cold, heavy, and strangely unbalanced. This was not the song. This was the key to the song. Grandfather was making me work for it, forcing me to follow a trail of breadcrumbs only a musician could truly appreciate. I stared around the room, feeling suddenly energized, the panic replaced by a focused, thrilling hunt. Where on this piano, which part of this complex instrument corresponded to the treble clef, the number 5, and the star? The treble clef was obvious. It dictated the higher range of the keyboard. The number 5 could be a key position, the 5th octave, or maybe the 5th key in an octave, the white key E. The star? The star was the problem. It could be metaphorical, referencing his requiem for the lost stars, or literal. I began systematically examining the piano. The soundboard, the polished wood beneath the strings, often had a decorative star or rosette near the bridge. I shone my phone's flashlight inside the piano. Nothing. Standard construction. I went back to the number 5, the 5th octave. I placed the tuning fork handle near the E key in the 5th octave, just resting it there. Nothing happened. The star? Where had I seen a literal star? My eyes were drawn back to the massive iron frame, the structural component of the piano that supports the immense tension of the strings. The frame, which bore the manufacturer's name, Steinway, also featured decorative cast iron elements. I traced the pattern with the light, searching until I found it. High up, near the tail end of the frame, hidden by the lid's hinges, was a small, 5-pointed cast star, part of the iron molding, usually overlooked. It was no bigger than my thumbnail. I took the tuning fork and carefully brought the prong of the brass instrument toward the cast star. It wasn't magnetic, but as the brass touched the iron star, I heard a low, metallic hum. Then, slowly, painfully slowly, the metal of the star began to depress, sinking inward about a millimeter. A new sound followed. The creak of old heavy wood shifting inside the piano's main body. The bottom lip of the piano, the part resting on the wooden supporting structure and closest to the floor where the pedals connected, began to separate from the main case. It was opening like a drawer, but horizontally, revealing a dark, narrow space where the wooden frame met the pedal lyre. This wasn't a small compartment. This was a significant structural breach of the piano's lower structure. To open it fully, I realized, would require significant force, and the risk of irreversible damage to the pedal mechanism was astronomical. If I ruined the pedal lyre, I might as well have taken an axe to the whole thing. But the gap was widening, showing just enough space for me to see a flash of pale parchment paper deep inside. The song was in there. I had less than 18 hours left, and I was staring at a moment of truth. Risk everything, or lose the song forever. The tuning fork had done its job, but the next step felt like a criminal act against a priceless instrument. I gripped the brass tightly, adrenaline surging. I needed to open that bottom section, and I needed to do it now, before the sun rose and Sarah's sensible footsteps sounded on the stairs. I had to become a destructive force to save my grandfather's legacy. The sight of that parchment paper, tucked deep within the horizontal slit near the pedal lyre, sent a jolt of pure, addictive urgency through me. It was real. Sarah's cold, hard pragmatism, the useless piece of furniture argument, was crumbling before my eyes. But the access gap was terrifyingly small, a sliver of darkness, and trying to pry open the heavy, reinforced bottom lip of a concert grand was an act of barbaric folly. It would splinter the wood, crush the delicate pedal rods, and leave irreversible damage, an outcome that would not only destroy the piano's value, but more importantly, betray the reverence my grandfather had for his instrument. He had made it accessible, yes, but not by force. He had hidden a mechanical marvel, and I had to use an equally elegant, non-destructive method to complete the access. I pulled back, sweating despite the chill of the old house. The clue I had used to open the matchbox compartment was the tuning fork itself. Treble clef, 5, star. I had used the star, the iron casting, and the pedal, the sustain action, to initiate the crack. But the treble clef and the number 5 were still open variables. I held the brass fork in my hand, its weight comforting. Grandfather was making me use my ears, not my muscles. This wasn't a lock, it was a harmonic activation. I needed to find the exact frequency, the exact note that would resonate the hidden mechanism open. The treble clef indicated the upper register. The 5 almost certainly pointed to the 5th key or position within the C major scale, G, or perhaps the 5th octave. I decided to start with G. I struck the tuning fork against the heel of my palm. The clear, vibrating hum was not G. It was slightly higher, a distinctly bright, shimmering tone. I quickly ran my fingers across the white keys of the 5th octave, listening intently. It wasn't the A440 of a standard tuning fork, nor was it the E I had briefly suspected. The pitch perfectly matched a high F sharp, an F sharp. The key of the unexpected, the key that musicians often used for dramatic, bittersweet compositions. The key grandfather loved to use when he wanted to move an audience to tears. It was the perfect hidden key. Now, where did the 5 come in? It couldn't just be the F sharp. I remembered a conversation we had years ago. He was showing me his first custom-made music box, a tiny, intricate device. He explained that he had engineered it so that the melody would only play if he pressed down on the 5th hammer, the small wooden component that struck the string, forcing a specific alignment. The word hammer echoed in my head. I had to reach the hammers inside the piano. I raised the main lid and propped it open, revealing the intricate, beautiful architecture of the strings and the action. It was a cavern of polished wood, felt, and copper wiring. Using a small penlight, I peered down into the strings near the F sharp in the 5th octave. The hammers, covered in white felt, were lined up like soldiers. I counted them, starting from the lowest note upward. This was too time-consuming, too complex. I went back to the opening I had already created, that tiny, accessible slit near the floor. The parchment scroll was visible directly below the 5th F sharp string. The strings are grouped into 3 for the higher notes to create volume, but the mechanism for the strings themselves has distinct divisions. What if the 5 referred not to the keys, but to the 5th wooden spacer separating the action from the tuning pins? I looked at the top of the piano's action again. Near the F sharp, there were a series of small, lacquered wooden blocks used to stabilize the string playing. I counted them from the left side of the piano's main sounding board. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The 5th spacer block, positioned directly above the F sharp strings, was slightly recessed. It was barely noticeable, but the depression was definitely there. I struck the tuning fork for the F sharp, the note resonating in the quiet room. And with the vibrating metal still humming, I gently pressed the prong onto the 5th spacer block. The response was immediate and mechanical. Not a snap, but a low, satisfying whir. The sound of a small, oiled gear turning for the first time in 5 years. The bottom lip of the piano didn't just open a fraction. It dropped down on perfectly silent, miniature brass hinges, a hidden drawer finally released. The parchment scroll, which was not paper but thick, heavy vellum, was lying inside, nested in the custom-cut velvet. I pulled it out. It was a long, tightly rolled cylinder, bound with a piece of faded indigo silk ribbon. My hands, which had been steady throughout the delicate operations, began to tremble now, the finality of the discovery washing over me. This was it, the ghost composition. I unrolled the vellum scroll on the piano's music stand. It was stunningly beautiful. hand-drawn notation in my grandfather's distinct, elegant script. The ink was a vibrant, deep black, as if the piece had been finished only yesterday. But my elation immediately fractured. It wasn't a finished, playable song. The top half was a dense, almost impenetrable array of musical symbols. Yes, but woven through the staves were strange ciphers, letters, Roman numerals, and cryptic phrases. It looked less like music and more like an encrypted language. It used a system based on the circle of fifths, a coding method grandfather had once demonstrated for fun, where keys weren't notes but represented locations or timings. I scanned the page frantically for something I could understand, and then I saw the title, stark and clear at the top, followed by a dedication. Title: The Fifth Star, a variation for 2 hands and 1 witness. Dedication: to my one and only apprentice, who remembers the house, the night, and the rain. The Fifth Star. The name was a chilling echo of the clues I had just used, but the dedication was the true revelation, the one that turned the paper from a composition into a confession. This wasn't the song. It was a map. The variation was a set of instructions, and the dedication was a direct, personal challenge. He wasn't talking about his music. He was talking about the circumstances of his death. The night he died, there was that massive storm, the one that cracked the sky and plunged the neighborhood into darkness. The house, the night, and the rain. It meant that the final, unreleased score, the true swan song, was not contained within the instrument, but was hidden somewhere in the house, its location coded into this cryptic vellum. The piano was just the first lock, and I had only 12 hours left before Sarah sold the whole place. I suddenly realized the immense, terrifying truth. The song wasn't just a piece of music, it was grandfather's final, elaborate game, one that connected his last composition to the very moment he left the world. And I was the only player. The vellum scroll felt like a heavy stone in my hands, a beautiful and agonizing burden. I had bought myself a few more hours, but now the real deadline, Sarah's appearance at the estate, was breathing down my neck. She would arrive with the removal crew around 9 a.m., and if this enormous complex scroll wasn't deciphered by then, my quest would end with a furniture dolly. The coded notes swam before my eyes, an infuriatingly complex layer of secrecy woven into the fabric of a musical composition. I was faced with my grandfather's final and perhaps greatest challenge. I started dissecting the cipher, trying to map his artistic mind onto the physical space of the house. Elias Thorne had a brilliant, if eccentric, system of assigning meaning to keys. I remembered him sketching it out once. The tonic key, C major, always represented the center of the house, the drawing room where the piano sat. Moving clockwise along the circle of fifths, G, D, A, E, represented movement into the eastern wing and the rising sun, where his study and more active spaces were. Moving counterclockwise, F, B flat, E flat, signified the older, darker, western parts of the house. The library, the attic, the basement. The first legible line of the cipher was a short, staccato phrase, a quick series of quarter notes, F, B flat, G. I translated this into a physical route, F, the library, west wing, B flat, the basement access, extreme northwest, and G, the study, east wing. It was a frenzied back and forth, a frantic search pattern that mirrored the music. The quarter notes, I reasoned, represented a sequence of 4 physical objects to touch or interact with in each room. My heart pounding with a mixture of hope and rising desperation, I left the piano and flew to the west wing. The library was huge, lined floor to ceiling with books. Following the code's time signature, 4-4, I touched 4 objects in the F key room, library, and moved on. Then, a dash to the basement access, the B flat. That area was cold and damp, filled with the ghosts of forgotten things. I systematically touched 4 specific points on the rough stone wall that corresponded to the rhythmic notations. Finally, I raced up 2 flights of stairs to the G key room, grandfather's study. I repeated the process, tapping 4 objects in the precise, quick rhythm dictated by the vellum. I waited, breathless, for something to click, for a secret drawer to spring open, for a sound to indicate success. The silence was the only answer. A deep, mocking, and profound silence. I slumped onto his leather chair, the leather squeaking under my weight. It was a dead end. I had spent 3 precious hours, and all I had achieved was a manic sprint across 3 wings of the house. The initial euphoria of finding the scroll was rapidly draining into bitter, cold fear. I had missed something fundamental. The code wasn't just structural, it was personal. I looked at the vellum again, focusing not on the notes, but on the dedication. To my one and only apprentice who remembers the house, the night, and the rain. The rain, the night he died, the night the power went out, the night the requiem for the lost stars was finally complete. My mind went back, a forced recollection of that stormy evening 5 years ago. I was 13. The storm hit suddenly. Grandfather and I were playing chess in the study, the G key room. The rain was drumming so hard on the slate roof that it was deafening, but one sound cut through it all. The constant, uneven triolet rhythm of the deluge hitting the wide, brass-framed skylight above the main staircase. Tink-a-tonk, crash. It was an insistent, asymmetrical beat that had fascinated Grandfather. He'd even paused the game to mark the rhythm down in a tiny notebook. That was the witness. The code wasn't about the physical location of the keys, but the rhythm and dynamic associated with the notes, translated through the memory of that storm. I sprang up, rereading the F-B-flat-G cipher through this new lens. The quick quarter notes no longer meant 4 touches. They meant the 4 hardest, loudest beats of the rain. The F, library, and B-flat, basement, weren't destinations. They were specific, resonant objects inside the study, capable of creating the correct tone. I looked around the study again. What F-note object? The ceramic pitcher near the window, a high, sharp F tone when struck. What B-flat object? The massive marble bust of Beethoven on the mantelpiece, a low, flat B-flat thud when tapped lightly. And the G? The G-note object must be the thing that completes the circuit, the one that needed a long hold like a sustained note. I looked at the tarnished brass doorknob on the library door. It was heavy, circular, a perfect resonator. I stood there, heart hammering, and executed the true code. First, I tapped the ceramic pitcher, F sharp, clean. Second, the marble bust, B flat, low, dull. Finally, I grabbed the heavy brass doorknob, G. I didn't turn it, I just held it, applying pressure as if sustaining a note. Nothing happened to the door. But beneath my feet, I felt a faint, sympathetic vibration travel through the floorboards, emanating not from the door, but from the wall adjacent to it. A wall covered by an ancient, threadbare Flemish tapestry depicting a celestial map. The same map, I realized with a shock, that adorned the sheet music cover of the Requiem for the Lost Stars. I ripped the tapestry from the wall hooks. It fell in a silent heap. The plaster and wallpaper behind it were cracked and faded, but running vertically down the center was a thin, almost invisible seam in the stone molding, a perfect straight line that had been painted over and disguised a dozen times. A slight cool breeze was escaping from the seam. It smelled like earth and old paper. I pressed my ear to the seam. I could hear nothing but the faint sound of the wind. The G note had opened something, but only minimally. I had found the final lock, hidden behind the tapestry of his most famous work. The ultimate hiding place was not a box or a drawer, but a hollow cavity inside the structural wall of the house itself. I had maybe 6 hours left before Sarah arrived. I needed to get inside that wall, and to do that, I would have to start chipping away at the foundation of the house itself. I had gone from preserving a piano to potentially destroying a load-bearing wall, all for a piece of music I hadn't even heard yet. The elegance of the music had led to this moment of brutal, necessary vandalism. I had abandoned the gentle precision of the dental picks for a cold steel chisel and a small, heavy mallet, repurposed from the tool shed. I placed the tip of the chisel against the painted-over seam in the stone molding, right where the cool breeze was escaping, and brought the mallet down in a sharp, controlled strike. The sound was shockingly loud in the library's suffocating quiet, a dry, grating crack that echoed through the empty wings of the house. Dust exploded, filling the air with the choking smell of pulverized mortar and old stone. I worked with frantic, desperate energy, chipping away at the disguise, gradually widening the seam. Every blow felt like an assault on my grandfather's memory, a desecration of the quiet space he cherished. But the knowledge that Sarah would arrive within the hour, transforming this sanctuary into a cash asset, fueled my destruction. I had to choose the lesser of two evils, structural damage or the permanent loss of his truth. After 10 minutes of agonizing, dusty work, the front section of the molding peeled away, revealing a dark, custom-built cavity within the wall. It was perfectly squared off, lined not with plaster, but with smooth, dry wood, an isolated, climate-controlled space. Inside, resting on a bed of dry felt, was a single object, not a scroll and not a sheet of music, but a small, heavy box of black, lacquered wood. It looked like a miniature version of the piano itself, polished to a dull sheen, with a single brass clasp closure. It was the final lock. My hands, now filthy with stone dust, carefully lifted the box out. It felt heavier than it looked. I unclasped the brass fixture. It opened silently without a single creak. Inside was a single, thick, leather-bound journal. The leather was midnight blue, and on the cover, embossed in simple gold leaf, were the words, "The 0 Hour Sonata, Chronicles and Completion." The 0 Hour Sonata, not the fifth star. The vellum was the map, but this journal was the key. I opened the journal to the last entry, my vision tunneling to the looping, confident script of Elias Thorne. The entries detailed the final, feverish stages of the composition. He wrote that the Requiem for the Lost Stars had been a necessary precursor, a clearing of the musical palette. But the 0 Hour Sonata was his true legacy, a piece of such complexity and emotional depth that it captured the entire cosmos within its structure. I skipped to the final dated entry, which matched the day he died. It was written rapidly, the ink slightly heavier than the preceding pages. "It is done. The last chord is struck. The storm outside is the perfect conductor for this ending. The 0 hour approaches, the moment of utter silence before the new sound. This sonata is not just music. It is an expression of my deepest resolve, that the legacy and the truth it carries must be protected from those whose avarice and impatience would destroy it completely. I have built the perfect defense against against their ceaseless demands and their desperate need to liquidate everything I hold sacred. They will search for the safe, for the bank accounts, for the digital files, but they will never think to look in the silence, in the resonance of the instrument itself. I wish I had more time, but the power is flickering now, and I must secure the truth. The blackout will provide the perfect cover, the rhythmic punctuation mark for my final act of preservation." I stopped reading, a cold knot tightening in my stomach. Avarice and impatience against The sister's name was Sarah. The timing of the blackout. This was no gentle farewell. It was a race against a specific person, a calculated act of defiance. My grandfather hadn't just died. He had been actively hiding the truth from someone in the family moments before his life ended. I flipped to the very last page of the journal. The final words were scrawled and hurried, the pen digging into the vellum with violent urgency. I hear the front door opening. They are early. The storm must have covered the sound of their car. They are coming for me, for the documents, for the quick solution. I have seconds. The final composition is safe, but the truth requires a witness who remembers the storm. I must tell them the final truth. Look to the time of the 0 hour itself. Remember the silence before the light returns. The last note played was not on the piano. It was struck against the writing stopped abruptly, a thick, dark ink smear dragging diagonally across the paper, indicating a sudden and violent interruption. Not a peaceful slide into oblivion, but a struggle. The pen had been ripped from his hand. The truth was not that grandfather died peacefully at the piano. The truth was that he was interrupted by the person he was hiding his greatest work from, Sarah. The 0 Hour Sonata wasn't just a composition. It was a testament, a final statement about the circumstances of his death. I looked down at the coated vellum still spread on the piano stand. A variation for 2 hands and 1 witness. I was the apprentice. The 2 hands were the keys to the puzzle. But the witness was still the key to understanding the final terrible sentence. The last note played was not on the piano. It was struck against the realization hit me with the force of a blow. The wall dust, the sweat, the adrenaline, it all vanished, replaced by an absolute, terrifying clarity. The final, damning piece of evidence was still in the room, waiting for the true witness to find it. I grabbed the journal, scrambling to my feet, ready to run. And then I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of tires on the gravel driveway outside the library window, far earlier than her 9 a.m. deadline. Sarah's dark SUV had arrived. I was trapped in the library, covered in dust, holding a journal that potentially accused my own sister of involvement in our grandfather's death, standing before a gaping hole in the wall. The door handle to the library, the brass G note I had just held, began to slowly turn. The witness had just become the accused. The brass doorknob turned slowly, an agonizing squeak accompanying the movement, the sound magnified by the silence of the rest of the house. I scrambled backward, grabbing the blue leather journal, the 0 Hour Sonata, and shoved it beneath the voluminous folds of the fallen Flemish tapestry. My grandfather had built the secret. Now I had to execute the concealment. I took 2 quick steps, standing defensively between the open doorway and the gaping, dusty hole in the wall. My clothes were smeared with stone dust, and my heart was a frantic drum kit against my ribs. The door swung open, and there stood Sarah. Her immaculate business suit, tailored and severe, seemed to absorb all the natural light in the hallway. Her face, usually so composed, was sharp with an icy displeasure that instantly overshadowed the pragmatic concern she often showed. But the look shifted instantly, from displeasure to cold, wide-eyed shock, as her gaze passed over my shoulder to the destruction behind me. "Alex, what in God's name happened here? What did you do to the wall?" Her voice was low, controlled, but the tremor of pure, naked rage underneath was palpable. She didn't look tired from the early morning drive. She looked charged, as if this was precisely the confrontation she'd been anticipating all night. "I found it," I said, my voice hoarse but steady. "I found the song. I found the final work." She scoffed, a dry, dismissive sound that was instantly grating. "That ridiculous story? You've destroyed a piece of the house's foundation, Alex, for a myth. You're going to pay for that damage. The buyers will walk away, and you'll have ruined the estate for good." She took a step toward the hole, her shoes crunching on the mortar dust. "Move!" As she approached, demanding access to the cavity I had just emptied, my mind raced, clinging to the final, incomplete sentence in the journal. The last note played was not on the piano. It was struck against the... I couldn't reveal the journal now. It was too explosive, too specific, and too easily dismissed as a forgery in the immediate chaos. I needed the final, physical evidence that grandfather had left behind, the one thing that would connect Sarah to the scene of his final moments. Struck against the... He was interrupted as he wrote. The strike wasn't a piano note. It was the physical act of an object hitting something else. I looked around the room. The desk, the books, the marble bust I had just used. My eyes landed on the colossal black piano. It wasn't the keys. It wasn't the wood. It was the iron plate, the massive gilded iron frame that supported the nearly 20 tons of string tension, the only section of the piano's structure that wasn't covered in fragile wood or felt. It was a massive, silent bell. If something was struck against it, it would resonate with a sound of deep, overwhelming finality. I spun and darted toward the piano, diving into the open area near the strings. Sarah shouted my name, demanding I stop, but I ignored her. I peered into the dark recesses near the tuning pins, scanning the massive, curving iron plate for any sign of impact. And there it was. Low down, near the tail end of the iron frame, where the bass strings were anchored, a tiny, almost imperceptible gash in the glossy, dark lacquer of the iron plate. It was a fresh wound, thin but deep, a mark that couldn't have been there for years without rusting. It was the exact spot where his pen, or perhaps his hand, had connected with the metal, creating a final discordant clang as he was pulled away from his journal. But the physical evidence wasn't the gash itself. Trapped right inside the lacquer crack, clinging to the edge of the wound like a final damning signature, was a single, tiny, fraying thread of indigo silk ribbon. The same indigo silk ribbon that had been used to bind the Zero Hour Sonata vellum scroll inside the piano. The ribbon that had come directly from the hidden compartment I had opened hours before. Sarah's hurried arrival that night, interrupting him as he was securing his legacy. A struggle ensued, and the ribbon, the proof of what he was doing, was ripped, leaving a thread behind on the instrument he was trying to protect. Sarah was now standing right behind me, her breathing ragged, her voice venomous. "Get away from that piano, Alex. You are done with your games." She grabbed my shoulder, her grip surprisingly strong. I wrenched myself free, turning to face her, the realization of what she had done, or what she had witnessed, ringing in my ears. I didn't need the journal. I had the silent witness of the iron. "He didn't die peacefully, Sarah," I whispered, pointing an accusatory finger at the faint, telltale thread of blue on the iron plate. "He was interrupted. He was writing the truth about you when the power failed. He hid his life's work from your avarice, and he hid the fact of your involvement right here. That ribbon proves you were here, inside this house, inside this room, at the exact 0 hour he wrote about." She looked down at the tiny thread, her face draining of color, the rage replaced by a terrifying, hollow fear. She didn't deny it. She couldn't. Her composure shattered completely. "It was an accident," she hissed, the admission hanging between us, the true, terrible meaning of the 0 Hour Sonata finally unlocked. "He collapsed. I just tried to take the notes." He said he was leaving everything to that ridiculous music foundation, not the family. He was destroying us. Her panic was the final devastating piece of the puzzle. The grand piano wasn't a useless piece of furniture. It was a coffin for a lie. The sound of the worker's van, the heavy scent of coffee, and the clatter of metal equipment began filtering in from the hallway. Normalcy was returning, bringing the real world back to this scene of emotional and physical ruin. Sarah stared at me, then at the hole in the wall, then back at the piano, her life and her reputation hanging on the balance of that tiny silk thread. I took a final breath, holding the leather journal tightly behind my back. The estate sale would not proceed. The piano would not be moved. The unreleased song, the 0 Hour Sonata, was not just a musical masterpiece. It was a harrowing, final testament, a hidden statement about the true cost of genius and the devastating price of truth. The song had been found, but the legacy of Elias Thorne was now forever marked by silence and accusation. I had won the game, but I had lost my family. The music was free, but the family was irrevocably broken. And all of it, every dark secret, was locked inside the resonance of that massive, silent black piano.